So this part of Chapter 1 deals with more of the laws involved in protecting a person that provides first aid. In Part 1, we talked about what first aid is and why it's important. Now we're going to look at some laws to protect us. So a first aid provider can be sued. There's no doubt. If you're doing things improperly, you can be sued, but you can minimize that. First, you need to make sure you're obtaining the person's consent, meaning they're giving you permission to work on them. Don't exceed your training level. Work within your scope of practice. Explain why you're giving them first aid and everything you're about to do before actually doing it. Make sure they're okay. And once you start treating them, do not walk away. Stay with that person until further medical help arrives. Consent means you're giving them permission to work on you and touch you, and etc. It's unlawful to begin first aid without consent. Touching a person without their consent is known as battery and can be, prosecuted in a court of law. So there are two types of consent. Informed, also known as expressed, meaning the person can verbally give you consent or nod with their head, meaning they're alert, they're mentally competent, and they're of legal age. Nodding of a head is okay. As long as you're getting their consent, you can begin doing some type of treatment. Implied consent, this is for people that are unresponsive. They can't nod their head, they can't speak. So in life-saving interventions, it is implied that they would have given you consent to save their life. An alert person who doesn't resist first aid is assumed to have been given implied consent. So if they're not resisting, they've implied that it's okay for you to do it after you've explained everything. With adults that are mentally incompetent or children that are under age, they need to have a consent from a legal guardian or a parent. But if those people are not present, the first aid should be given based on implied consent to save their life. A police officer is the only one that has the authority to restrain and transport a person against their will. So if someone doesn't want treatment, you call the police. And if you really feel that they need this treatment, because they're the only ones that have the authority to restrain them and force them against their will. If they are refusing help, explain to them what their condition is and why you think it's so important to help them. Call 911. Try to get them to accept the care. Make sure there's witnesses around so they can corroborate that you did try to explain things to them, and call the police. Once you've responded to an emergency, you must stay with the person. Do not walk away. That's considered abandonment, and you can be held legally on that account. Negligence is if you don't follow the accepted standards of care based on how you were trained and it results in further injury to the person, you can be sued for negligence. You have a duty to act, especially if you are a person that is trained and certified in first aid. You might be designated by your employer, and you might be licensed by the state. You may have a pre-existing relationship with a person. You have a duty to act. There are different standards that apply depending on the type of first aid that provider that you are, so you need to understand that. There's different organizations that certify you, that give you that information. If you do not act the way you're supposed to, it's called a breach of duty. An act of omission means you fail to do what another reasonable person with your training would do in the same situation. An act of commission means you're doing something you should not be doing, and a person with the same training of you would not do. They have that same training you have, they wouldn't do it, but you do it anyway. That's considered an act of commission, which is a breach of duty. Injury and damages that you can incur could be physical damage, physical pain and suffering, mental anguish, medical expenses, loss of earnings and earning capacity. You could be sued for all of that if you are not within your scope of practice. So that means you cannot exceed your skill level. Do what you can do with what you've been trained to do. So if I'm a first aid responder, I'm not a medical doctor, so I cannot do what a medical doctor would do, or even a nurse. Stay within your scope of practice. When you are working with someone, it is imperative to remain confidential. All of their information, anything about them, is private and should not be discussed with anyone except that person that's injured or ill, or any person that they have designated as a medical person that is working with them, or medical professional that you're dealing with. The law requires that if there's any form of rape, abuse, or gunshots, you need to report that. There are things that help to protect us, because otherwise nobody would want to assist anyone else because they're afraid they're going to get sued. There's something called the Good Samaritan laws, and this encourages people to assist others because you will be protected as long as you're acting during an emergency in good faith, meaning you have good intentions. You're not getting paid to do it. There's no malicious intent. There's no gross negligence toward the person. You're just trying to help them. And if you stay in your scope of practice and do what you've been trained to do and no more, you will be protected even if something else happens. The Good Samaritan laws do not protect first aid providers if you've caused further injury due to negligence because you've given first aid poorly or worked outside the scope of your training. The best thing to do is prevent injury. Better to prevent than treat, and we prevent with the 3 E's: education, enforcement, and engineering. An example: education, swimming lessons. You're teaching a person to swim. That would prevent drowning. Enforcement are laws such as wearing seatbelts and driving a bicycle with a helmet. Engineering is anything that can assist, such as airbags in the car or child-resistant packaging on medications. Strategies to identify interventions can be applied to any illness or even an injury. It's called the Haddon Matrix and has 3 phases: the prevent phase, event phase, post-event. Prevent phase, you're trying to stop anything from occurring. The event phase, you're modifying any consequences that might occur. And the post-event, something has happened and now you're trying to return the patient to fullest form of functioning. An example is a motor vehicle crash. A pre-event is laws against drinking and driving. An event is when you get in the car, you're wearing a seatbelt and making sure you have had no alcohol. At post-event would be, unfortunately, there was an accident, but now you're initiating a rapid EMS response. So that's a brief overview of the laws that can protect us as first aid providers and the second half of Chapter 1. Refer to your book as well as the other resources in Blackboard to continue learning more about the information.